Thomas and Sarah were an elderly couple. They were in financial trouble. One night, a thief broke into their home and stole all their savings. Soon after, the landlords threw them out because they couldn't pay the rent. Desperate, the couple used their last money to buy a ruined house outside the town, at least to be able to say, "We won't be paying rent anymore." But that house wasn't an ordinary ruin. A hidden passage in the floor concealed a secret bunker filled with gold, worth $178 million. And this discovery would reveal not only their fate, but the hidden history of the entire town. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching this story from? If you enjoy incredible discoveries that change ordinary people's lives in an instant, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story will truly surprise you. Thomas was 68. His hair was thin, yet it still looked full and dense. Deep lines framed his eyes. Those lines were not just the mark of age or sun. Each one was the imprint of years of labor. Every morning he woke before sunrise. After washing his face with cold water, he looked in the mirror and spoke to himself. Hold on one more day. For Sarah was 65. She tied her white hair back, went to the kitchen in the mornings, brewed a nice tea, and looked out at the street through the small window. Their home was small. There was very little space between the kitchen and the living room. But the more Sarah loved her nest, the larger every room felt. Before breakfast, she filled Thomas's thermos with coffee. She screwed the lid on tight and said, "Don't forget again." Thomas forgot every time. Sarah always scolded him for forgetting, yet she still smiled. It was their little ritual. Even in poverty, they managed to keep their joy. Their home was a rental. They lived on the ground floor of a weathered white building on a narrow street at the edge of Milton Springs. From their windows, they didn't see a road, but the empty lot behind the fences. That lot grew a little bigger every year because the surrounding houses were being sold one by one and turned into parks or storage units. Thomas would say, "I wonder when they'll come for our place." And Sarah would answer, "As long as they leave us alone." But fate passes by no one without touching them. Thomas worked at the car wash at the town's entrance. Years ago, he had driven trucks. His knees still ached from those days. But he'd say, "If I stop working, I'll rust." In the summer heat, suds would float over the asphalt. The water hose grew hot under the sun. It nearly burned his hand when he held it. His boss was young, 28. Not exactly unkind, but fond of giving orders. "Tom," he'd say, "don't leave spots on the bodywork. If the customer sees, it'll be a problem." Thomas would only lower his head and say, "Okay, boss." When he got home, there was very little money left in his pocket, but he still told Sarah, "Got a lot of tips today." Sarah stayed at home. Housework never ended. She wiped the window frames, took the curtains down, and hung them back up. There was no air conditioner, only an old fan. Even so, the house always smelled clean. In the evening, she went into the kitchen and cooked Thomas's favorite beans. The two of them ate at the same table in silence. Even without speaking, they understood each other with their eyes. They had met 40 years ago at a friend's wedding. They had been side by side ever since. They had neither children nor regrets. "The two of us are enough for each other," Sarah would say, but money was lacking. The debts piling up were growing. Bills multiplied on the table. Sarah kept a ledger. On the narrow-ruled page, she wrote down every penny and said, "We need to save here." Thomas would say every time, "We'll manage." One July night, it was hot. The windows were open. Dogs barked in the distance. Thomas left the living room window open to let some cool air in. He woke near dawn to a sound. At first, he thought it was the wind. Then he heard the sound of a drawer closing. His heart sped up. He slipped out of bed quietly. Sarah mumbled, "Thomas." "What was that?" "Shh, be quiet." He stepped into the hallway. In the dim light, a man slipped past like a shadow. Thomas didn't know what to do. "Hey!" he shouted. The man flinched and headed for the door. He had a black bag in his hand. Thomas lunged, but his knees wouldn't allow it. His foot caught on the rug and he fell. The man ran without looking back. The door slammed. Outside, an engine roared and faded away. Sarah turned on the light. Her face had gone white with fear. What happened? Thomas was out of breath. The safe! He took it. All our money? Gone. Both their eyes turned to the same spot, the small tin box on the bottom shelf of the cabinet. Inside was the savings of years. Thomas's tips, a few dollars left over from curtains Sarah had sewn, the envelopes they'd put aside on birthdays. All of it was gone. In the morning, the police came. They jotted a brief note, took a few photos, and left. This happens a lot around here, the officer said. He closed his notebook. Sorry for your loss, he added. It was the kind of empty consolation you hear when everything is already over. For the rest of the day, they sat in silence. Thomas stayed at the table, Sarah in her chair. The fan turned. Papers fluttered. The day ended, night came. The heat did not let up. That evening, Thomas said, "We'll manage again." Without lifting her head, Sarah said, "This time it's hard." No answer came. A week later, there was a knock at the door. The landlord, Baxter, was there. He was a heavy-set man in a tie. "Mr. Turner, hello. You haven't paid rent for 3 months." "I know, Mr. Baxter. Everything we had was stolen. Please give us a little time. I understand, but I have payments too. If this continues, I may need to start legal proceedings." Thomas clasped his hands. "Give us a month." "A month is too long," Baxter said. Sarah stepped in. 15 days. "Just 15 days." Baxter gave her a frowning look. 15 days, he said. "But after that, you may need to vacate." When the door closed, silence filled the house again. Sarah sat on the edge of the table. "We have nowhere to go," she said. Thomas closed his eyes. "Maybe we'll find somewhere." "We can't pay rent." "Who would take us?" Thomas couldn't answer. That night, Sarah looked out the window. Lights were on in the building across the street. In those windows, TVs, laughter. In her own window, only hot air. She drew a slow breath. "Thomas," she said, "if we had a home of our own one day, no one could throw us out." "Maybe," Thomas said. The next morning, Thomas went to work early. Seeing how tired he looked, his boss said, "Thomas, what's wrong? Take a rest if you want." "Resting doesn't bring money, boss," Thomas replied. He picked up the hose and started washing a black car. Suds dripped onto his shoes. His hands reddened in the hot water. But he didn't stop. At lunch, he looked in his bag. Next to the sandwich Sarah had packed, there was a small note. "As long as we're together, we can overcome anything. Thomas, I love you." Thomas smiled. He slipped the note into his jacket pocket. He was reminded once more that he loved his wife more than anything in this world. He worked hard that day and came home late. Sarah opened the door. "You're tired," she said. "I'm not," Thomas said, but his knees trembled from fatigue. He sat at the table. Empty plates met empty eyes. Sarah said nothing. Thomas said, "Maybe we can find a place outside of town." "For sale." "Yes, but cheap." Sarah lifted her head. "Really?" "We'll try." "As long as we're alive, there's hope," Thomas said. Sarah smiled quietly. In that moment, a small light of hope flickered in the heart of poverty. In the days that followed, they checked the town's notice boards. House for sale headlines were full of needs repairs warnings. Most were expensive. Some were sturdy, but for rent. One day, walking down the road, Sarah found a small flyer. The paper was yellowed by the sun. It said only this: "Burned house. For sale, cheap." Below it, an address, Hollow Creek Road. Sarah tore off the edge of the flyer and slipped it into her bag. That evening she showed it to Thomas. "Burned house," Thomas said. "Why would anyone buy that?" "Because we can't buy anything else," Sarah said. Thomas lowered his head. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe ash is the best soil to start over." They didn't talk much that night. They just sat hand in hand. Hot air drifted in through the window. Sarah rested her head on Thomas's shoulder. "If we ever get out of here," she said, "let's have a home that truly belongs to us." Thomas nodded. "Then no one can throw us out," he said. Sarah smiled. "Maybe then we'll find peace." Thomas didn't answer, but something stirred in his heart. That something would become more than a home. That night they decided to buy the house, and they had no idea a new life was waiting for them as the sun slowly rose over the low roofs of Milton Springs. Sarah wrote "Moving Day" on a page of her notebook. She drew a small heart beneath it. She made 3 little boxes side by side, handover of keys, loading the vehicle, arrival at Hollow Creek. Each box sat like a breath. "We'll start today," she told herself. "It won't finish today, but we'll start." Thomas got up early. He washed his face at the sink. The cold water rinsed the sweat from his brow. He looked in the mirror and smoothed the edges of his grey beard with his hands. "For Sarah," he whispered. "And for myself." When he entered the kitchen, Sarah had just set the kettle on. She poured the tea into 2 slender glasses. "Heat is cured by heat," she said. Their hands didn't tremble as they held the tea. Resolve rose from the glasses like steam. There was a knock at the door. The landlord, Baxter, appeared, wilting in the summer heat. His tie was loose, and beads of sweat tapped against his glasses frame. "Time's up," he said, showing the papers. "Key handover and exit report." "I'm sorry. I understand," Thomas said simply. Sarah squeezed the key in her palm. The cold of the metal sank deeper and deeper until it touched her heart. She took one last look at the living room. The shadows of the curtains were still visible on the walls. The mark left by the couch sat on the carpet like a frame. In a whisper she said, "Thank you." She knew the house wouldn't hear. But she didn't leave the farewell unfinished. Javi, the young friend from the car wash, was waiting on the corner. He'd come to help Thomas that day. "Tom, I brought the truck," he said, handing over the key. "I brought straps too, so the load won't shift in the bed." Thomas's eyes welled up, but he passed it off as sweat. "Thanks, son." They shouldered whatever was easy to load: the toolbox, the fan, 2 pillows, a blanket, a small cabinet, plates and glasses, 2 pots. Sarah held the photo album in her lap. The album was heavier than a house. Neighbor Paula on the corner peeked through her curtains. Curling her lips, she said, "The end of an era." Sarah ignored her. Thomas got behind the wheel. The engine started, a tired growl, then a steady hum. The car rolled from the street's shadow into the sun. The smell of summer, heated asphalt, the distant smoke of a barbecue poured in through the window. They passed the last station on the edge of town. The billboards ended. Emptiness took their place. The earth, in July's heat, looked like a wound with a scab. Along the winding road, rusted fences, wild weeds, forgotten barns. The Hollow Creek sign appeared. The arrow was hard to make out between letters eaten by rust. Thomas slowed down. The car rattled. Dust turned to gold powder in the sunlight. The burned house rose at the base of the hill like a body braced against the wind. The south wing of the roof had collapsed. On the north face, 2 window frames had survived. Soot spread across the walls like a darkened map. The oak tree out front bore scorch marks on its trunk, yet clung stubbornly to a crown of green. Before opening the door, Sarah looked at the tree. "It's still breathing," she said. "So are we," Thomas answered. "First job, clear the porch." Thomas pulled the nails with pliers. The board's tongue loosened. Sarah went inside and flung the windows wide. They exhaled a hot, heavy old smell into the open air. In the kitchen, she spread newspaper over the counter, readied a bucket of water, worked the soap into suds. Black water ran down the walls and pooled on the floor tiles in little lakes. "Every lake a memory," she said. Thomas laughed. "We'll rinse the memories too." By noon they were out of breath. They plugged in the fan. Its blades clattered and pushed a soft wind through the room. Sarah soaked stale bread and married it with tomatoes. She didn't spare the salt. Thomas blinked. "Best sandwich I've ever had." "We'll make better ones, too," Sarah said, drawing a small star in her notebook and adding a note. Day 1, we breathed. On the second day, they made a hardware market run. 2 cans of paint, a roller, 2 brushes, brass locks, a few hinges, a mixed box of nails and screws, 2 meters of chain, electrical tape. On the way back, Thomas reinforced the steps. He removed the slat that read "Danger of Collapse" and set solid boards in its place. When Sarah began to lay paint across the kitchen walls, the room seemed to widen all at once. Sunlight passed more gently under the new coat. The grey she chose for the hallway gathered the shadows. It didn't hide the old, but it softened its roughness. On the 3rd day, a priest from the nearby church came by. He tipped his hat with a smile and left a box: soap, pasta, canned beans, 2 bottles of water, a small scripture card. Burned houses sulk, he said. When they hear human breath inside, they make peace. In the afternoon, 2 men appeared, no ties, shirts tucked in, but with the stance of certainty. A municipal inspection, they said. A high structural risk, Sarah replied. I'd like to see the current report and the notice. They handed over an envelope. A paper from 2 years ago with an illegible signature. Sarah glanced at it. We won't leave without an official notice. The men looked at each other and backed off. When Thomas closed the door, he exhaled deeply. You held firm, he said. My heart's pounding, Sarah said, pressing her chest. But my knees are steady. Summer pressed heavier on the morning of the 4th day. No wind. The air lay over the house like a blanket. While Sarah was adjusting the shelves in the kitchen cabinets, the back of a panel seemed to breathe. The screws didn't sit right. A thin coolness leaked from the back. She turned the screwdriver and tugged the panel. Thomas! She called. Thomas brought the flashlight. A metallic line winked through the gap. The tile pattern broke at one point with a deviation so small the human eye could barely catch it. Thomas took the pocketknife from his jeans. When he pried lightly along the line, a rusty plate appeared beneath the tile. 3 small keyways on it. Let's try, Thomas said, showing the keys that had come with the property folder. The first 2 wouldn't turn. The third settled into place with a quiet fit. A quarter turn. A deep sound thumped from within. 2 more locks accepted the same key. The mechanism moved through the metal. The hatch slid sideways. Dark gray, rubber-lipped steps. Cool air rose from the floor, shoving the hot air aside as it washed their faces. We don't have to go down, Sarah said, but curiosity ran in her eyes like water. We need to hear what this house is telling us, Thomas replied. Leaning on each other like walking sticks, they took the steps down. Time moved differently below. There was no damp. The air was dry and steady. Labels on the concrete corridor's walls. Water filtration, air circulation, emergency power, cable trays were laid with military discipline. At the end, a thick door awaited them. Storage 1 was written on it. Thomas pushed. It opened silently like a well-oiled hinge. Inside, order was greater than fear. Shelves up to the ceiling. Towers of canned goods, medical kits, batteries, fuel cans, toolboxes. All the date labels had been updated by the same hand for years. In the corner, grey steel safes stood in 3 neat rows. On each safe, the same warning. Insurance. Do not open unless necessary. Necessity means hunger to some, greed to others, Sarah said, eyeing the warning. Thomas quietly turned to a safe's dial. He set the sequence to the parcel number from the property papers. One more click. The lid lifted slightly. A yellow glint answered the flashlight. Sarah wrapped her hand in a cloth and reached in. What she touched was cold, smooth and obstinately heavy in her palm. Ingot, she said. Thomas swallowed. Gold. Second safe, third safe. The same seals, serial numbers, the same meticulous care. On the edge of a shelf sat a folder labeled Stock Summary. Sarah opened it, tables, weights, dates, exchange notes. At the bottom of the last page, one small but clear line, total value, $178 million. There was no scream, no wild joy. Both fell into a long silence. The hearts they had braced for years against collapse now loosened, as if settling into chairs. Thomas pulled out a chair and sat Sarah down. That number means our door will be knocked, he said. As Sarah slowly closed the folder, she added, that number means a test. There was a narrow room, set up like an office. Maps pinned and linked with red string wove a spiderweb across the wall. In a drawer, a small notebook. Use when necessary. Trust no one. Doors open both ways. A date beneath 30 years ago. On the desk, a yellow note taped down. Those who touch with greed get burned. Sarah traced the sentence with her finger. Whoever wrote this knew the language of money, she said. And it's hell, Thomas murmured. The first panic gave way to a slow plan. They closed the safes and reset the combinations. They snapped quick photos of the office files. Thomas transferred the images to one of 2 USB sticks he'd bought at the town stationery shop. On the other stick, he saved only the stock summary, serial numbers, and the notes from the office. One's in my pocket, he said. Sarah hid the second stick in an empty jar behind the sack of flour in the kitchen. As she twisted the lid on, she asked herself, who opens a jar? Hands that open what shouldn't be opened look for the easy first, Thomas replied. When they came back up, the afternoon sun left a golden stripe on the oak's scorched trunk. Sarah spread an old rug over the kitchen floor hatch. The rug's pattern erased the tile's line. She set a small metal-legged side table on top. 2 empty glasses sat on it. The secret was now covered by the everyday. In the evening, they sat on the porch and drank water. Tea would heat the body too much. Today, water was right. This gold won't make us rich, Thomas said suddenly. It'll make us targets, Sarah nodded. And a burden to do what's right, she said. But we'll carry the burden together. Thomas closed his fingers over Sarah's. We've done that for years. The next morning he went down to town. At the bank, he filled out a form for a safe deposit box. We'll call when one opens up, they said. From the hardware store, he bought 2 more locks and a door bolt. From the stationery shop, spare batteries and a small calculator. I want the numbers where my eyes can see them, he thought. He added wheat bread, cheese, and 2 bottles of water at the market. On the way back, the wind was still hot, but Thomas felt steadier, like he'd driven a strong nail into a mountain's face. The day's plainness soothed the fear. A second coat went over the first. The grey made the shadows softer. An extra bolt went onto the back door. The chain was latched from within. New sills were nailed beneath the windows. In the afternoon, the oak's shade drifted a gentle coolness into the living room. The fan's hum was no longer tired but steady. Sarah drew lines in her notebook. Doors locked. Files copied. Food enough. Us together. In the afternoon, the phone rang. The number was hidden. Before answering, Thomas looked to Sarah. She nodded. Answer. A calm male voice spoke on the other end. Mr. Turner? A few security questions regarding your property. The sentence began with a banker's courtesy and curled toward a debt collector's bluntness. Send an official request in writing, Thomas said. I don't discuss things over the phone. His voice didn't shake. On the other end, a mocking little laugh. Of course. And the line went dead. You locked the phone, not the door, Sarah said. They served the same function, Thomas answered. Toward evening, they cleared around the oak's base. They pulled the weeds up by the roots. Between the charred bark, live veins appeared. Sarah pressed her palm to the tree's trunk. The soil is hot, she said, but the inside of the tree is cool. Like a person, Thomas murmured, burned on the outside, a secret within. In the first hours of the night, they descended into the shelter once more. This time, they were prepared. They found the scale in the office. The label read, Calibration 2005. Deliberately, they chose only 2 gold bars. Wrapped them in cloth, weighed them. The numbers matched the records. They wrote down the serial numbers in the notebook. Took photos, saved twin copies on the USB. Then they placed the bars back, closed the safe, and scrambled the lock code. Sarah leaned toward the edge of the office map. She noticed a faint pencil note, barely visible. Someone will come. Not for greed, but for peace. Someone, she whispered, maybe us. When they came back up, the night had fully settled. In the distance, a train whistle. Farther still, a dog barked. The sky, though stingy, showed a few stars. On the porch, they sat side by side, drinking coffee. I think tomorrow, Sarah said, we'll clean not through the windows, but through our hearts. For the first time, Thomas said. We're talking about the future, not the past. By morning, sunlight cut through the curtains like a blade of gold. Sarah slid the wardrobe panel back into place and closed the latch of the hidden drawer. She went to the kitchen and brewed tea. Thomas said the bank had called. A safety deposit box might open in 2 weeks. 2 weeks can feel like 2 years, Sarah said with a smile. But we know how to wait. Final preparations. A second chain on the back door, a peephole on the front, temporary mesh for the windows. Sarah filled jars with rice and beans. The house's creaks were no longer frightening. They were rhythm at the hottest hour of noon. The rug and the metal beneath it remained perfectly silent. The secret did nothing but test the resolve in its owners' hearts. That afternoon, Thomas reread the note Sarah had written for him. The corner was curled from sweat. The thinness of the paper could not hide the weight of the love it carried. "Tonight," Sarah said. "One more list, things to do for peace." She wrote, "Proper distance with neighbors. Find one trustworthy lawyer, backup copy in the church safe. Tell no one about the gold." Beside it, she drew a small, straight line. "Kindness spreads, secrets stay." At sunset, the oak's shadow draped across the burned wall like a long handkerchief. Sarah rested her hand on Thomas's arm. "You know," she said, "on the first day we came here, this house didn't look at me. I looked at it. Now it's looking at us, and we're looking at ourselves," Thomas added. Their eyes followed not the line beneath the rug, but the one in the sky, the boundary between day and night. That night, they both slept briefly but deeply. There was no wind, yet inside them a breeze moved. There is order, there is plan. There is us. The shelter waited, holding hundreds of serial numbers in its steel chest. The files, written in an old hand, kept carrying someone's story forward, and the house, burned, wounded but drying under fresh paint, breathed calmly. At first light, Sarah looked at the oak and whispered, "Today we won't call anyone. We won't tell anyone, but we'll tell each other everything." Thomas smiled. "We used to have no money," he said. "Now we have money. But what we had back then is still here, being together." Beneath the floor, gold worth $178 million. Above it, 2 chairs, 1 table, a fan, a teapot, 2 hearts. The surest sign that a house is being reborn was right there, while wealth waited below. Peace worked quietly above. Summer was slowly turning to autumn as the wind scattered the oak's leaves. The burned house atop Hollow Creek looked utterly different now. Its walls mended, curtains hung on its windows, 2 chairs set on the porch. But the greatest change was within the hearts that lived inside those walls. Every morning, Thomas and Sarah woke at the same hour, drank their tea together, and sat silently on the porch. The sunrise was a new miracle to them. The house that hid a $178 million secret beneath it no longer filled them with fear, but with peace. One morning, when Thomas entered the kitchen, he found Sarah at her writing desk. In front of her lay an envelope and a small notebook. On the cover, in her handwriting, it said, "Golden Path Foundation." Thomas approached quietly. "You've prepared it?" he asked. Without looking up, Sarah answered, "Yes, everything's here." The envelope was a donation agreement. Sarah had been researching for weeks. There was a small foundation outside the town that cared for orphaned children. It had been losing state support for years and was close to closing. The first time Sarah visited, her eyes caught on the walls painted with muddy handprints. The innocence in those smiles had wrapped itself around her own longing for a child. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked. A faint smile touched Sarah's lips. Yes, this gold wasn't hidden to save us. It was hidden to lift someone else. And now, its time has come. They went down to the shelter in silence. Thomas turned on the flashlight. The gleam of metal briefly blinded them. The same writing still marked the safes. Thomas ran his hands over the words. "I understand this now," he said. "They unlocked them one by one. They didn't weigh or count the bars. They only took enough to deliver the trust. They rented a small truck and filled out the official papers. They told no one what they were carrying. That evening, they stopped in front of a small building outside town. A sign on the door read, Golden Path Orphan Home. An elderly woman opened the door, white-haired, soft-voiced. "Yes," she said. Sarah pulled out the envelope and held it out with both hands. "This is for a beginning," she said. The woman felt its weight. Her brow furrowed slightly. "I can't thank you enough," she said. Thomas raised a hand. "Please don't thank us. We're just paying our debt." At that moment, the laughter of children echoed from inside. A little girl at the window waved at them. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Maybe," she whispered, "we never had children of our own. But we can still touch 100 hearts." Thomas held her hand. "And that's a legacy greater than any child." Months passed. The foundation was rebuilt, new dormitories, classrooms, playgrounds. The town newspaper wrote about the couple as anonymous benefactors. No one knew where the money came from or how it was found, but everyone knew that the once burned house in Hollow Creek had become the warmest place in town. One evening, Thomas sat on the porch. The sun dipped behind the oak, and in the wind he could hear the faint laughter of children far away. Sarah came beside him, carrying 2 glasses of tea. Thomas lifted his glass. "True wealth is peace," he said. Sarah smiled. "And we've found it." A gentle breeze stirred. The oak's branches swayed as if singing. For the first time, the house was completely still, because at last, inside and out, it was whole. That night, before sleep, Thomas wrote a note, short, simple. "Fear buried the gold. We unearthed it with love and turned it into peace." By morning, the sun rose again. A new day, the same tea, the same 2 chairs. But nothing was the same anymore, because in that house the traces left were not of greed, but of mercy. And as Hollow Creek's quiet wind carried the story of Thomas and Sarah, the world became, if only a little, a better place. If you listened to the story until the end and liked it, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel.